And when ye tallow hardens, we remove it from yon mold.
What a crappy candle!
You've ruined our vacation.
The Simpsons.
Hello, and welcome to The Simpsons Countdown, the podcast where we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons, tracing the creative evolution of the series and counting down to find the exact moment in which it began its downhill journey into irrelevance. I'm Erix Antoine, and this week I'm joined by my dear friend Josh Fein. We'll be discussing I Married Marge, which originally aired on December 26, 1991. The episode was written by Jeff Martin and directed by Jeffrey Lynch. In this episode, Marge thinks she may be pregnant and goes to visit Dr. Hibbert. In the meantime, Homer tells Bart, Lisa, and Maggie the story of the early days of his marriage and the circumstances surrounding Bart's birth. The episode is the second of the big flashbacks chronicling the early days of The Simpsons, and as such, it is kind of a sequel to The Way We Was. Josh and I talked about that one last season, and it's only natural that we sit down now to discuss this one. So without further ado, here we go.
Kid, I won't let you down. I swear to you. When you come out of there, the first thing you're going to see is a man with a good job.
Yeah, the doctor.
So here we are again, Josh, talking about this is the sequel to The Way We Was. So of course it is it's appropriate that you and I be talking about this. It's the sequel. It's the second flashback episode of The Simpsons. It continues. It picks up the story basically where The Way We Was left off. The Way We Was left off with Homer and Marge getting together, right?
That's right.
It doesn't really touch upon any more of the intricacies of their relationship after that. It touches upon how they met, how they fell in love, how they got together, and that's where it stays. And now here we go into detail of their early days. The early days of their relationship, the early days of their marriage, and that's what this episode is really about. It's once again uses the flashback structure, which in difference to the first one, like I think the flashback structure here, the framing device is a lot more, it's better. Because the framing device for the first one was like the TV broke, so let me tell you a story. It's kind of like, all right, they pulled that out of their ass. But here, there's an organic reason. There's a reason for this story to be told. I always talk about that, whether it's this or the X-Files podcast, I always talk about a story having a pregnant moment, and how that needs to be, there's a reason for the story to be told at this moment. So here it literally is a pregnant moment. It's Marge believing that she may be pregnant, pregnancy test, Barnacle Bill's home pregnancy kit does not work. And
but it came with a free corncob pipe.
That's right, yes. And so she has to go to the doctor to see if she's pregnant. In the meantime, Homer decides, reminisces about their first experience of Marge being pregnant. And that's a good setup. And I think that it works a lot better than something ham-fisted like, oh, the TV broke, Well,
it's not one of those typical sitcom tropes that we've talked about in the past and that have come up throughout this podcast. I think it's something that, as you said, it's a more natural framing.
So before we get into it, what's your opinion of this episode? What's your memory of it, and what's your current opinion of it?
Well, it's another episode I saw first run. It was an excellent episode.
Yeah,
I'll never forget. I think I saw it with my folks, laughing pretty hard when the old woman grabs the business end of the Slashco knife. I was still laughing at that today. It's a classic episode.
Oh, hello, young man.
Good evening, madam. You have been selected by the good people of Slashco to reap the benefits of their new Never Dull knife edge. Here, shake hands with the Slashco.
Ah!
Handle first. Handle first.
It's definitely in the canon of the great Simpsons episodes. I think again we see more of that foundation being laid about the relationship of Homer and Marge, and what they went through, And I think it's really interesting that, one, obviously it's been 30 years since this episode was first aired, so we have to now remind ourselves that Bart would now be 41 years old by this point in time.
Yes.
But that Homer was 24 when he had Bart. So he's actually, we figure out that he was born in 1956, and that he's only 34 and he's got 3 kids, and that it was of that not even of that era, but of those times you would expect to have kids when you're a bit younger in life. And it's in the circles I travel in, I don't have kids of my own, but I know of people that are around my age that they either had their first kid. I know one woman who used to be my boss has 3 kids, and she's a couple of years younger than me. And it's something to see that as you get older, that you encounter people that they're having children themselves. And I think it's, as you said about the framing, I think you're right about the framing. I think it's even funny that they're making fun of the framing. The fact that the kids are disinterested with what Homer says, the fact that they're playing croquet in the backyard. That's how bored they are from Homer's conversation
Yes.
about Bart. And then later on, they're playing Chinese checkers. But it's again, more of that humor coming through with still some excellent sentimental moments, I think, in the episode. And then framed all in yet another great flashback episode where we have some period references to 1980, which I always think is kind of a weird year to depict, because as Homer says, it's the beginning of that turbulent decade, the 80s. And it's 1980. Carter's still president. It's still the 70s for all intents and purposes. The 80s hadn't become the 80s won't be for a couple of years. So everything's all still looking like the 70s. We got a couple of references here and there. There's the Logical song, which I got wrong the last time when I thought it was a Billy Joel song, and I think you said it was a Supertramp song, right?
Yes, it's a Supertramp, the Logical song.
Yeah.
Actually, interesting what you just said about 1980, because it is very much a kind of, it's the 80s, but it's still the 70s for all intents and purposes. And you're absolutely right. In terms of aesthetics, in terms of just the general pop, it's a transitional period. Like those years, like 80 to about 82, I think is kind of a transitional period between the 70s and the 80s in terms of what we consider, in terms of cultural and socio-political aspects. It is kind of a transitional period where it's not really the 70s, but it's not really the 80s. It's this period that's sort of there. And it's an interesting thing to think about, that in the aesthetics of it and all of that, how the episode puts little details and their cultural touchstones. And I guess, like, when you look back, when they have those things on VH1 or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And they talk about, like, oh, I love the 80s or whatever, and they have, like, the top 10 cultural milestones of the 80s. And what I'm wondering is, do these things show up there? I mean, does Empire Strikes Back show up there? Does Dallas, I Shot JR, does that show up there or not? Because it's part of this transitional period. Starting with Dallas, for example, right? Dallas is a show that, of course, was huge in the 80s. So if you think back to TV of the 80s, you think of Dallas, the, primetime soap. But it began in the 70s. And I'm not sure in which season it happened. I'm not sure where the famous Dallas episode, A House Divided, aired, which is, the season finale of Dallas, whichever season that was, where JR was mysteriously shot. And then, all summer long, everybody was like, ooh, who shot JR? And then you had, like, that was but I don't know what year that was.
No, that was 1980. That was
in fact 1980.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That was 1980. So that would have been, so basically the events of this episode, like this episode, I suppose takes place in like the summer and fall of 1980.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because we see Marge isn't pregnant by the time Empire comes out, which I think was that would have been
that would have been the summer of 1980. Let's do. Actually, you're totally right. You know what? That's right there. That tells us when this episode takes place. I mean, it takes place. Presumably, it takes place over several months. It takes place over a 9-month period. But they go out on that date. It opened on May 21st, 1980.
Okay, so so the start of summer, basically.
Yeah, so basically, so we could, we don't have any way of knowing if they went to see it on opening night, but we can imagine that they must have gone somewhere in that week.
Well, not only that, it's pedantic to say that if they got, Bart was conceived on the night of, when they saw Empire, then yeah, he would have been born in 1981. But, that's neither here nor there.
But hang on, let me stop. I mean, that's totally fine if he was born in 81, because it would mean that he's 10 years old in 1991.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's fine.
Okay, then he would be 40 as of this year. But I'll say this about Empire. The scene where Homer and Marge are going outside the line. Homer does the big spoiler about Empire, about Darth Vader being Luke's father. My dad, he saw Empire in the theater, and that was I remember him telling me that when that reveal came through. I mean, it's not groundbreaking when you hear about this type of thing happening, but yeah, everyone in the theater was shocked by that reveal. They were completely blown away, and that you had to worry about people, walking outside the theater and blabbing about what was about to happen, because you would have had no idea that was coming. And then I never was spoilers never bothered me about that type of thing, and because usually I end up with a lot of stuff I end up watching a little bit later. So like the stuff would say, I know you just finished WandaVision, so all that stuff is going out, and I always find all that stuff pretty funny to read about how people react and things like that.
It is interesting, the climate that we're living in now, right? Where what happens at the end of, Empire Strikes Back would have been a big deal in 1980, right? But see, I think people are terrified of spoilers now. In difference to you, like, I care about spoilers. Like, if you spoil a movie that I'm interested in, or anything that I'm interested in, a movie, a TV show, a book, a video game at this point, I'll be pissed off. But it's the climate we live in now. We live in fear of this, whereas in 1980, what happens there could literally only happen there. Like, you would have to be online waiting for the movie, and some asshole coming out would have to be raving about the movie, giving away the ending in order for that to happen. It's just that now what happens there on that line happens on Twitter.
And the way to get around that is you just don't participate on social media for the most part.
Exactly.
It's actually very easy to get around.
Yes, it really is. It's just that it just goes to show how connected some people are or choose to be.
Well, that they want to be controlling about it. To me, it's always, self-responsibility is not always applicable in certain situations. This is where it's one of them. It's like you could easily dodge this type of thing. And also, that you only have a certain amount of time before this is going to be public knowledge. I mean, I'll never forget it. I think I may have even said it on this show, where the reveal of the Crying Game was a huge pop culture event. You couldn't escape it. And that reveal has nothing to do with the movie at all. It's actually supposed to be this thriller about the Irish Republican Army, and Forrest Whitaker is in it, and you could not escape it, and it just threw everyone for a loop. They couldn't contain themselves. And I was hearing this. You hear it in a later episode of The Simpsons. You hear it in Living Color. You could not escape it. It was I think it was even in Seinfeld.
Yeah, it's parodied in Ace Ventura.
Yeah,
quite famously. It's this thing where, well, here's the thing about that. Like, I know for a fact that was a huge thing, where as soon as that movie came out and everybody was talking about it, then everybody was talking about, quote unquote, the secret of the Crying Game. And in the ads, it would even say the movie everybody's talking about, but nobody is giving away its secrets. And I'm like, no, I think everybody, like, you can look up this ad, like on if you look up like old archive where they have like newspaper ads and whatever, you'll see that. And then, or it might have even been like on the back of the video box or whatever. But the point is, that's actually not true. Everybody was talking about it, and everybody was specifically talking about the secrets. Now, here's the thing about the Crying Game. Okay, so I was lucky, because when the Crying Game came out, that's, what is it, 92, I think?
92, yeah.
Yeah. I think by the time the Crying Game came out, I was already living in La Paz, Bolivia. I had already come here. And so I wasn't in the U.S. for the whole big hoopla. And there was still no internet. So there was nothing. I didn't know anything about it. The only thing I knew about the Crying Game was because I would get like Premiere Magazine and Entertainment Weekly. So, you know, there was some stuff there from like when it was about to come out. And I think there was like a blurb for it or like a small piece for it on some Premiere Magazine that I got on the plane coming over to Bolivia. And so I kept it, you know, it's one of those, so it had like the plastic overlay that has like American Airlines on the spine. And there it said like, you know, something about The Crying Game being this good thriller from director Neil Jordan. Speaks nothing of the Secret.
Right.
And it is basically talking about it as you were saying, as if it were a political thriller about the IRA and the conflict and all of that, the troubles, as they call it, and all of that. So I thought that's what it was. And, you know, I filed it away because I liked the director. I liked Forrest Whitaker as an actor. I wasn't familiar with Stephen Ray, whatever. I liked the director and I liked the actors involved. And I didn't think about it. And then about a year, close to about a year later, I'm back in the U.S. on vacation. And I'm hanging out at my cousin's house. And he either taped it or it was going to come on cable. I don't know what it was. He had already seen it. But he's all like, oh, you've got to check out this movie, The Crying Game. And I was like, oh, yeah, I think I heard about that. And remembering from like the premiere thing. And he goes like, have you heard? I was like, no, you don't know. He's like, you don't know anything about it? I'm like, no, I don't know anything about it. I just know it's about the IRA or something. I'm like, oh, okay. All right. Well, just watch it. Just enjoy it. I'm like, okay, cool. So I was sitting there and I watched it. And so I was totally floored by it. I was like, whoa, what an interesting movie and what an interesting twist and et cetera, right? But now, flash forward many, many years later. Okay, flash forward about, I'm going to say this would be in the early days of my marriage, right? And so I'm showing The Crying Game, which I have on DVD, and I'm showing it to my ex-wife. And she's never seen it. She's never heard of it, okay? So I go like, hey, you want to watch The Crying Game? She's like, sure, let's watch that, whatever that is. She doesn't know what it is. She's Bolivian, whatever. And so I put that on. We're watching the movie. And within the first 10 minutes, it did not fool her for a minute. Like the twist was blown within the first 10 minutes of the movie. And she just blurted it out. She's like, okay, so that's whatever.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay.
I think I had the same reaction with you. I could have sworn I messaged you. This must have been years ago when I finally watched it, and I was like, how could you not tell? Like this was a shock to audiences. But here's the thing: you can.
It was to some. It was to some. It was like it was to me, and I remember like it was to me, and I watched it, and I was like, whoa, it's okay, interesting. And then I sat down, months later, I watched it with my dad, because my dad, who also had not heard of the movie. Mm-hmm. So this was the advantage of not being in the States, because you wouldn't be caught up in the whole cultural thing. And I remember we're sitting there, we're watching the movie, scene comes on, my dad's leaning back, my dad, a very masculine heterosexual male, he sort of just, the scene comes up, oh, she can do my hair anytime. So I'm just laughing, because I'm waiting for the big moment because I know it's coming. Oh, and so that's the thing. I'm like, all right, well, and yet now, for whatever reason, now it probably doesn't work.
I think it's.
I would be curious. It would be interesting to sit down with someone, because the thing with with my ex-wife is one thing, but I'm pretty sure that experience that she had must have been the same for many people back then. But for some reason, I think it was even more prevalent now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, here's the thing. You look back at certain things and you think, how could this be the case? The great example of, I remember this from Behind the Candelabra, a wonderful TV movie with Michael Douglas as Liberace, and he had sued. The women loved Liberace. No one knew that Liberace was gay, and that he had even sued a tabloid and won that said he was gay, and he won a case and basically tried to in court saying that he wasn't. And it's one of those you had to be there type moments, I guess.
One thing that you brought up that is a key. You said it's this twist that is a big shock, and that if you tell someone, they might get pissed off. But the movie does not actually hinge on that twist. It's not like blowing the ending of The Sixth Sense or something. It's not like that. It's basically like it's something that happens halfway through the movie that then changes your perception of everything that's come before it and colors what comes next. And it's very interesting. It's an interesting thing. And you then explore the relationship between these two people now that the dynamics of that relationship have changed. But yeah, I don't think it's something that entirely ruins the movie for anyone. You know, it ruins the surprise, maybe, but chances are that person was going to be able to see it coming anyway, unless like me, they just, you know, whatever, and or me or my father who just didn't, for whatever reason, see it coming. I think that twists, you know, like spoiling The Empire Strikes Back, okay, in 1980, I can see that being a real fuck you kind of thing. You know, I can see that being a real, oh my God, like really you had to blow that? Like that's a nice little surprise. Because that's literally the ending of the movie.
Well,
right?
And on top of that, you're standing in line for the movie. You know, it's you know, it's a real dickhead move. And interestingly, the guy who says, "Oh, thank you, Mr. Blow the picture for me," that's Dan Castellaneta's real voice. He's just voicing that one guy.
Yeah, that guy who looks very 1980. He's got the stash. He's got like the, you know, that's period detail. Period detail is important.
Oh yeah, very much that 70s overhang. Dr. Hibbert is still got his afro. Weirdly, they didn't make any period changes to Mr. Burns. They did it to Smithers. He had a different haircut. But I think it's fascinating with this episode because you get this from the commentaries that there are, you know, Sam Simon was kind of deriding the writers for saying you have like material for 3 episodes here. And not only were able to cram 3 episodes worth of material, this episode runs a little bit short. That's why you have certain images that kind of freeze, like when Patty, Selma, and Marge are taking their picture. It kind of freezes for a second. The other scene where it freezes is at the where Homer, in his montage of various jobs, goes and he works at a dog training school.
Yeah.
And he's just staring at the sign for what must be like 5-10 seconds. And it just freezes.
Yeah.
And that's because the episode ran short. It's not like a technical issue with the DVD
Yeah.
or anything like that.
Okay, that's interesting. It is very plotted. I saw that behind the scenes detail that you're talking about, where they said, you know, this could have been 2 or 3 separate episodes instead of just cramming it all into one episode. And I don't think I agree. I don't think you can make a whole episode just about Homer getting his job or just about Bart's birth. I mean, you could potentially do one just about Homer getting his job, and that's basically the dramatic arc of the episode. But you couldn't do one just about Bart's birth.
You know what it would have been like with Bart's birth? It probably would have been like the film Knocked Up. Basically, that it would have been something like an animated form, because you realize, you know, if it had been a full episode about Homer having to deal with the fact he's got a kid on the way, you know, there would have been a scene where he realizes he needs to take more responsibility for himself. You know, because in that one scene where he decides he's going to leave because he has to go out and support his family, it's, you know, there's nothing it's just something that he decides on his own, because his dad, Abe Simpson, is again giving horrible advice, basically cheering him on the fact that he knocked this girl up, got her, you know, is, you know, having a kid out of wedlock, and he's proud of him.
Yeah, no, he's basically saying, "You lucky bum, you was like the fish jumped right in the boat. All you got to do is whack her with the oar."
Yeah.
So basically saying like, you lucked out because he says like, why? Because it's the right thing to do. He's like, no, because you'll never do any better, right? So basically saying you got lucky, you got this girl pregnant, so now she has to marry you, you know. And that's like, whoa, that's really creepy and sleazy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's basically
Simpson.
the plot of, you know, what happens in Knocked Up, which I'm sure you've seen. I mean, it's no one has probably seen that movie in years, but I remember seeing it in the theater, and that's what I was thinking of when I was watching this episode. Yeah, I don't think that, honestly, I think, as you said, I think that we could have gotten it, but it's not necessary. I don't think we would have lost any, you know, the episodes would have been more bloated. They, you know, I don't think we would have gained any new insight. I think that the points that they're hitting are so impactful because, again, of the economy of storytelling, they have to, you know, they got to keep things moving. I mean, you have at the end, you know, where Homer goes to gets his job at the plant by basically saying he'll be the most spineless lackey you can get.
Yeah.
And he
yeah,
needs
basically
the job for that.
Yes. No, yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. I think this episode is fine just the way it is. I don't think that it has enough material for 3 episodes at all. I think it is a very well plotted, focused episode, which is about that. It's about Homer's transition into adulthood. That's what it is. So it's a perfect follow up to The Way We Was, which showed his teen years, showed how he met Marge, and now here we have his transition into adulthood, into full adulthood. He's a young adult. He's 24, got a girl pregnant, and I mean, the arc of the episode is him getting a job, him becoming a responsible adult, head of a household, quote unquote, and they're able to balance the moments of sentiment, like what you were saying, the decision that he makes, to leave. You have these scenes that are like dramatic scenes with touches of humor. This one goes into that maudlin territory of as I've labeled it in the past, a James L. Brooks episode, right? This is very much a James L. Brooks episode. But I think that it manages to balance out its sentiment with humor so it doesn't feel so maudlin. So even in that, when he writes the letter, it's like, you deserve all the greatest things in the world, and although I can get them for you, they will be repossessed. So like that's funny. Like that's a really funny line. Within the letter, it turns a potentially maudlin letter into a funny one because of that one line. And then of course you have like the job search montage, which for me is the highlight of the episode. It's the funniest sequence in the whole episode. That's got some of my favorite laughs, whether it's his job at like the what is like the Renaissance Fair or whatever it is.
It's like working at like a ye olde, like a Jamestown. Because I think you said you've been to Virginia. They probably have one of those like town reenactments of like something from the 1700s type thing. And he made a candle so poor that it caused a little kid to cry.
Yes, right. No, it's that's my favorite line in the episode. And when your tallow hardens, you remove it from yon mold. That whole sequence is great, but yeah, that thing, because I haven't been to that in Virginia, but I've been to things like it. Like I've been to, I mean, it's been years, but when I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time in Massachusetts. And at one point, went to Salem, and obviously they've got museums there because of the history of Salem.
Right.
And I do remember, I don't know if it was in Salem specifically or near Salem, but there was this one thing where it was an old town. It was essentially an old town. You walked in there and everybody was dressed in costume and everybody was in character. So I did that once. And one time, someplace in upstate New York, there was some like Civil War reenactment thing where everybody was dressed like in the Civil War and they were just in character once again. And that stuff's fun. So I immediately got what that was. I was like, right, it's one of those, recreate like, he works as a guy, one of those stupid old town things. He gets fired from that. He gets fired from being a knife salesman. He gets fired from, I mean, it's a great, very funny sequence that uses the 1980 hit 9 to 5.
Oh, absolute classic.
By Dolly
Fantastic movie too. But
very funny movie. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. And he's willing to do what he has to do to support Marge.
Again, balancing out the sentiment with some humor, with some cynical humor. And that's the thing. We see because this is a more, I guess, grounded episode, we also see a more grounded portrayal of Homer. Where, yeah, he's a jackass, but he's not he's just a regular guy, And
well, he's an underachiever. I think
he's an underachiever for sure. But he's somebody who, when the moment comes, he does sort of say, okay, he does assert himself. And he does make the effort. He goes out there, he tries to find a job. It's difficult for him, obviously. He's not very skilled. He's got limited skills and whatever else, but he's trying. He's trying really hard and to legitimately do it. When he marries Marge, when he proposes to Marge, he actually writes a very eloquent proposal. And you go like, the Homer Simpson that I think of when I think of Homer Simpson, the Homer Simpson of seasons 4 through 10 and beyond, is not somebody that I imagine writing an eloquent proposal like that. So it's interesting to see these little details still in these early episodes.
Well, not only that, if you go back to the letter that he writes to Marge, it's in cursive handwriting. It's like, yes. I didn't realize Homer was able to write cursive,
Yeah.
And
It's good penmanship too. It's
excellent penmanship. Yeah.
Yeah.
That can easily dissolve when you put any water to it. But yeah, that was surprising. That was something I never remembered because it's such a minor detail. But that, yeah, he could be quite eloquent. He just may not be able to say it, but he could write it out, which is the detail that certainly goes away as time goes on. I think that it's it's something with Homer where he's always, and this happens when in the future episode where Maggie gets born, he does seem to have a real fascination where he's really adept at doing low-skilled amusement work, whether it's at the mini golf course or the bowling alley. He just loves to do that. And,
well, it's he likes doing. He dreams of doing what he loves. Like working at a golf course is the height of success.
Mini golf course, not even a golf
mini
course.
golf course. Yeah, mini golf, and but the cursive thing. Like for example, full confession, I cannot write cursive.
Yeah, I can't do it either. I can sign my name. Although when I look back on it, I remember my first job out of college. It was a legal type of company that had retired judges and attorneys working there, and I had to read the reports, and some of the reports, these are esteemed people. They wrote in cursive. I couldn't read what they were saying. So it was a real pain in the ass, actually, with cursive compared to print. And my dad couldn't write cursive, and it was just one of those annoying things that you were told you had to learn in school. And thankfully that they've done away with. Again, when you talk about the balancing of the humor and the seriousness of it, I think it's summed up actually in the last scene when Homer goes back to talking about what he did to when he had Bart, and then that he was blessed with Lisa and Maggie, and they're proud of that. And I think that's I'm not a parent. I don't plan on being a parent. I know you're a parent. Maybe you can relate to that last scene where he's grateful of the fact that he's had the children that he's had. But he's immensely relieved that he's not having another kid because he doesn't want to go through the process of raising another kid.
Yeah, no, I can totally sympathize. I can sympathize with the whole thing because it's very realistically portrayed. I think anybody who is a parent who has been through something even remotely similar to this can relate to it because it's realistically presented. Whether it's the reality of becoming a parent in your 20s and then having to struggle because you being married and having to struggle to find a good job so you can support your family and so on. That stuff's done in a very realistic way. And then obviously at the end, right, when they're relieved, because they've got 3, and 3 is more than enough. So I was, I think, 25 when my daughter was born. Okay. She's 18 now. She turned 18 recently. I was 25 when she was born. And that's it. That's all I had, right? And so right now, I'm not married anymore, and I don't have any plans to have a kid. Now, if there would ever be the opportunity in the future, I would think long and hard about it. It might be a deal breaker because I would ask myself, do I want in my 40s to have another kid now? It's like to go through that. Like I would have been totally fine with it if it had happened back then. If we'd had maybe a second kid shortly after the first, because that's really the best way to do it if you want to have more than one kid is to try to have them right away.
Right.
Because if there's a huge space between them, then what ends up happening is that they're not growing up together, so there's that gap, and so you're going through it all over again. Whereas there's a reason to do it when you can have 2, because that way you'll 2 siblings that will be together, let's say. Okay, that's always good to give a child a sibling if you can, because that can be a good thing. Not always, but
right.
It can be, right? And especially if they grow up together, because that way they're sort of growing up together. You're sort of getting it out of the way. You're raising them at the same time. But when you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years between them, it's like you're stopping and starting. It's a roller coaster.
Yeah, everything you described is pretty much what happened with my family. Certainly that my younger sisters and brother, and for clarity, this youngest sister and brother are fraternal twins. So that's how they're, you have 2 of them. They're more, they grew up together around at the same time, so they're more, relatable. as you said, people can do what they want. I always thought it was weird for me personally. Like, I'll give an example. Jeff Goldblum. Jeff Goldblum is going to be 70 next year, and he had 2 young kids in his 60s. And I guess it goes back to what I was saying about with decision making in the last episode I was on. It's like, you think there's like a heartfelt, deep thought out choice being made. Like, no, there was just, we got drunk once and then someone failed to put on a condom, that type of thing.
Right. Well, usually, I mean, you know what? Like, that's usually what happens. I mean, you occasionally plan it. You occasionally think about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, but most of the time, the majority of times, it's what we saw happen in this episode. It's something that happens. You do sometimes get situations like, I have friends of mine, I'm not going to name them, but respect their privacy. But basically what ended up happening is like they're a couple. They've been together for many years, over a decade at this point, and well into it. But, she really wanted to have a kid. And so they were trying. Mm-hmm. They were trying and they were trying, and it wasn't happening. And, she's already in her mid-30s. So it's like, it's time. This has to happen. This has to happen now, And so they eventually were able to do it, but it was a planned thing. She had treatment and that kind of thing, right? So to get it done. So that's a situation where somebody planned it and said, okay, I'm going to do this. I want this to happen now. We're going to do this now. But that's not the usual case. I think most of the time it's like what we see portrayed in this episode. 2 people go see a good movie, get a little drunk. Actually, I was gonna say get a little drunk with champagne. Now, I was gonna ask you something about this because, I mean, maybe So, is that a thing, or is that just something? Is that her referring to? Is champagne something that exists, or that you refer to something as that? Because the only time I've ever heard it is here.
I've never heard it. I actually thought about looking it up and I didn't bother. It sounds like a parody. Like, it sounds almost like knockoff champagne, because you obviously can't, champagne can only come from that one part of country, portion of France. It's called sparkling wine anywhere else.
Exactly.
And, yeah, I think that's probably knockoff champagne. That's my guess. I don't think that's actually something that they made up. I mean, I know I could have easily looked it up and I just never got around to it. I mean, I think of it probably like whatever cheap buzzy liquor was at the time, like your Bartles and James or your Zimas or anything that's cheap and you get wasted on it pretty quickly. So I'll say this with their, it happens at the golf course where the action happens. Obviously, as a kid, I'm not going to get the symbolism of what's going on. I mean, did I know how babies were, where did babies come from? Yes. I mean, I knew that, a woman gets pregnant. Obviously, I didn't know the mechanics at that point, but so obviously the symbolism involved, I didn't get it as a kid. When I was watching the DVD, I was like, oh, that's pretty powerful. They're really hitting you over the head with it.
Yeah, no, it's bang, 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 bang.
And then they even get more graphic. I think in a later episode where they actually show the Homer's sperm actually going into the egg.
Yeah, they did that one.
That'll be for discussion for another time. But
actually, speaking of graphic and speaking of symbolism, now this might be a reach. But okay, so when because what we find out is that he was living with Barney in that shitty apartment, or at least hanging out with him. So whatever, they're watching Charlie's Angels and eating cookie dough, because of course that's what you do in 1980.
I guess.
And then she tells him over the phone, he's holding the cookie dough.
Yep.
And then he goes like, oh, and like the
whole thing oozes
cookie dough,
out.
like just like oozes out, like splurts out. Now, do you think is that a thing? Do you think that that's meant to imply something, or it's just a way to illustrate him getting tense when he hears about
it's
the news?
I think you could take it both ways. They didn't say that in the commentary. They didn't comment on it at all. And I mean, if it is, it's more subtle. I think it's one of those things that you could take it or you could leave it. I think it's just the fact that he's surprised and he just happens to be eating raw cookie dough, and then it just obviously looks phallic, and you know what the implication is.
Yeah, sure. That's what I mean. Yeah.
But I'll agree with you on that. I think you can go with what's implied with that. But I think it's more of a stretch than obviously the obviousness of what happens at the mini golf course. Unrelated, I could say I've never eaten raw cookie dough like that. You were certainly, I remember my mom, because it was a thing where like, yeah, you can't do it. It's got raw eggs in it. You're not supposed to. And at the time, cookie dough ice cream had become a thing. And it was a question of like, is this safe to eat or not? And yes, it was. It was absolutely safe to eat. So
yeah, I mean, why wouldn't it be? Like, all you do really is cut it up into little circles, put it on a baking pan,
and then you drop it in, and then the
that's
whole
all you do.
Anyway. So it's there's nothing to worry about that. But I have to appreciate the. I remember that. I think what was it, in Taxi, in the Reverend Jim's apartment, he had the giant copper cable wheel as his coffee table, and they have that in Barney's real shithole apartment.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll point this out too. I think it's interesting that Homer and Marge have been together at this point for 6 years. It's not, whether it was on or off, but they were together for quite a long time before this happened. Who knows what the timeline is, but they were committed up to that point for already. Again, if we assume that they were committed in high school, that was 1974. It's 1980, so now that's already 6 years. That's a good relationship right there.
Because it makes sense. You're with someone for 6 years, and maybe it's time to tie the knot. If things are really working, if you're thinking maybe you can move in together, have a family, why not, right? So I don't see any reason for it to have been an on and off thing. It could totally be a totally good relationship. If she didn't get pregnant before, it was because they were lucky. Because that's ultimately what that's how it is. I mean, it's a crapshoot. All it takes is one night of bad luck. Maybe maybe she was on birth control. Maybe he was using a condom, or maybe they were, as they call it, the Vatican roulette. Maybe, maybe they were doing that, maybe they were counting the days or whatever it is.
I don't think any thought was put into that. I think if you wanted to think this through, I think probably Marge was on the pill or something like that, because the pill was definitely around by that point.
Yeah, to prevent that from happening.
Yeah,
that makes the most sense. Yes.
Yeah, because I don't think it's. That's probably we're probably better off not seeing the episode where the whole idea of him getting Marge pregnant, because we probably would have had some terrible
6 years into their relationship. That because that's kind of your point. They are. They've been together for 6 years, and she hasn't gotten pregnant. She gets pregnant this one time that they go out on one date, of which we can imagine there have been many dates.
Right. Because he says that because he's been together. He had been dating Marge up to that point. They were together for that time. So it's who knows what had happened previously. I think it's just the fact that he's only 24 and that he has a kid on the way. I knew. Yeah. Which again, if we went back around that time, even around that time, or especially go back a couple of generations, that would be the expected time when you'd have a kid.
Sure, it's normal. Yeah. And my dad was also 24 or 25 when I was born. So like it's a normal thing. It's the normal kind of time period.
Yeah. My dad, my folks were a little bit older. They were 29 and 30, which is still young. And then my sister, I have a nephew now. So my sister was 26. I guess it just goes back to what I said before about the circles you travel in, where you live and who you hang out with, that you think, well, having kids is a normal thing. It's just, something I was thinking about. And again, as you mentioned before, you were 25. I imagine that would have been was that the expected age? Something that you would think, all right, maybe this around the time, this is kind of expected of me, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, it wasn't, because much like anything else, this wasn't, in my case, it wasn't necessarily something that was planned. But it was something that was, when the time came, it was something that was decided. Because again, it wasn't planned, but then it was decided.
Right.
Yes.
You have to make a choice on that. Yeah.
Yes, we're going to go through with this. Okay, fine. So that's the thing. Like, yeah, it happened at that time. I didn't ever think about it. It was like, I thought, well, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. It's not something that I wanted, certainly. But when it happened, I said, well, then I guess it's okay. I guess the time has come for me to do this. And that's it. And I do think that, 24, 25 is a reasonable time for it to happen. I think much before that is probably not a good idea. And, well, as far as much later, that depends on the person.
It depends on the person. I agree with you.
That depends on the person. That depends on the person. But it would be more about, like, maybe 24, 25 is, like, the earliest that it should happen. If you're younger than that, you might not be ready for it.
It's a maturity thing.
Yeah, so it's probably not a good idea. All due respect to anyone who's had kids that young, but it's probably a better idea if it's in the second half of your 20s as opposed to the first half of the 20s.
Yeah, and
certainly not
then,
your teens.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Again, because as I said, it's a maturity thing. But after a certain point, you have a whole life here, and that's your responsibility to take care of that child, and and you don't want to do anything that's unfair to the child, unfair to the kid.
One of the important things is when you name your kid.
This is a great. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. What are you going to name the kid? Because you can think of any name you want.
Right.
And a lot of hippies are responsible for inflicting torture on their children by giving them these really fucking weird names. But my point is that what do you do? It's a big responsibility because that's the name. The kid's stuck with that name.
Right.
Until they can legally change it as adults, they're stuck with that name. You've got to be really careful what you name.
And that's a
kids.
great use of humor is the fact that Homer misses the most obvious one with Bart. And
yes, I was gonna say that because he's thinking of he goes she's throwing out suggestions and he's going what kids might call him at school to tease him and whatever else, right? And he's doing it by playing the name game, as is what we see, because he goes what about Bart? And he's like, Bart, Cart, Dart, Eart. And it's all right, yes, and he's fine with that. Homer, you forgot about the verse that goes, banana fana faux fart.
Yeah.
You forgot about that when you're playing the name game. But anyway.
I loved it. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to have this whole thing about, I remember having this conversation with my mom because we actually had this old baby book in the house. And I remember seeing little tick marks for possible names. I asked my mom, I was like, hey, what names were you considering for me at the time? I thought this was interesting. And then, and then I learned at one point I was going to be named Ethan, but my dad knew a guy named Ethan that he hated. So I was like, we're not going to name the kid after someone I don't like. So we're not going to do that. And then I could have been named Gabriel, which would have been interesting, or Elliot. And this is, maybe right around E.T. or something like that would have came up. But I imagine you must have had. Did you have a similar conversation when naming your daughter or anything like that? I imagine not to to the point where you're making fun of the name, trying to think of what the the mindset of an 8-year-old is going to do on the playground.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. Our conversation wasn't that detailed. Didn't play the name game, and it wasn't so much. I didn't think about the specifics of what she would be called, how she would be teased at school.
Because the kids at the playground are going to come up with something. They're merciless.
Yeah, that's the thing, because the one thing that Homer does not account for is that it doesn't matter what the fuck you're called.
Yeah.
Because a kid, when they want to tease you, they're gonna figure out a way to tease you.
Oh yeah.
If your name doesn't lend itself well to an alliteration, they'll think of something. Kids are clever.
Oh yeah, and they're mean like that. I think it was.
Yes, so they'll find something else to call you. It's not gonna matter. They'll make up a name for you if they have to.
Oh, they will. Yeah.
So that won't matter. The thing about it is that it was just about a name that she might like, right? It came to that. Try to come up with a name that was not too traditional, and also not, she wasn't. I remember that my ex-wife was like, I don't want her to have my name because that's going to be 3, because she was named after her own mother. So it'd be so it'd be 3 of us with the same name. So we're not doing that. No way. And then it was so let's think of this other one. And so that's really what it was all about. It was more logistics. It was more about a name that we thought was nice, sounded nice, and that would fit. That's how that went. But no, it was not the way that Homer did it. It wasn't about, how will they tease her? it was, which is, I suppose it's a valid conversation to have, but
I mean, also it's just there's going to always be new and exciting ways for children to torture each other that way. I know the conclusion of how I got my name was that at the time, and this is also why you see a bunch of guys my age with the same first name, is because at the time Joshua was not a popular name around in the early 80s. So everyone had the same idea, and they all everyone named their sons Joshua, and that's why there's now a cluster of guys my age with the same first name. I mean, I remember when it's just generationally there are just these names that come up. Now that's why we all are. You just suddenly the name Joshua just started coming up more and more and more. Let me ask you this: did you ever ask that about with your dad? Why'd you get the name that you got?
Well, I mean, I actually know that story, and I'll go ahead and I'll tell you that. But before I say that, just to sort of not lose track of this, I had not thought about that in terms of Joshua, of it being clustered at a specific time in history, because I know a lot of Joshuas, and I well, I mean, a lot is a strange word to use, but I know several. I know several Joshuas. One of my best friends, his name is Joshua, and I knew at school Josh, right? I knew several Joshes growing up and in life. So, but it never. So I just thought it was a fairly common name, a fairly common name like John. I always thought of it as a fairly common name.
Well, John is like the most common.
It's absolutely.
Name. It is.
I thought it was basically. I mean, not to. Please don't take this the wrong way. Yeah. But I always thought that Joshua was like the Jewish version of John. I always thought of it that was it's a fairly common name. It's a fairly common
you're not
Jewish
wrong
name.
in that. I mean, it's certainly a name.
Joshua, Aaron, like those two.
Aaron, Howard. I have an uncle named Howard.
Fairly common within
Barry,
a certain cultural spectrum.
Yes. No, you're right about that.
So yeah. So our final word on the episode, because we've been talking for a long time here.
Yeah.
So our final word on the episode is that this is good. I wanted to do one final thing on the ending. Okay. I think that the way that Homer ultimately gets his job is funny, but
depressing when you think about it.
Well, yeah, yes. But the thing is, it feels a little anticlimactic at first, because you go like, that's all he had to do? Okay. It feels like something where the writers, like trying to look at it from like a writer's perspective, it feels like this thing where they went like, well, okay, so he tries and he fails, but we know that he eventually is going to work at the power plant, so we have to get him there. What do we do? And it's like they couldn't think of anything. And then somebody came up with the clever idea of, why don't we just have him just burst into Burns' office, and because of his attitude, which is very forceful, yet still telling him, look, I'm going to kiss your ass. I'm going to have no spine. I'll be a complete lackey. I'll have no personality, but doing this while being very full of personality and charisma. It's interesting and it works, but it feels a little bit like they just tacked that on.
It's a send-up of those scenes where like the guy's going to go down to the boss's office. It's what leads to usually the slow clap where he tells off the boss or something like that.
Right.
And it's a send-up of that because he's, as Burns says, he is feisty yet spineless.
Yes.
And we've already known he blew the interview. He completely fucked it up. I mean, he's not qualified, but because he's so assertive in the fact that he's unqualified, that I guess that in Burns' eye, it made him endearing in such a way that, we'll just hire this, this boob here and, put him somewhere. And even though he's eminently unqualified to do the job.
That is then counteracted by him at the hospital telling off Patty and Selma. And that's a very satisfying, dramatic moment. That actually works as a climactic moment for the episode, where they've been treating him like shit the entire episode. Mm-hmm. And at the end, he's like, shut the fuck up. He doesn't use those words, but he basically just, he tells him off. He tells he says, shut up. And then he's like, I'm paying for this. I have a job now. You can't treat me that way. You're going to have to respect me now if you want to be a part of this family. Right. And so even though, they continue to disrespect him in future episodes. But the point is that for this one moment, that's what makes it satisfying. The combination of him getting his job in a very ridiculous way, and then standing up to Patty and Selma, who are essentially the foils of the episode.
Hey! Who wants to get rich today?
Me! I said it first.
First, let me assure you that this is not one of those shady pyramid schemes you've been hearing about. No, sir. Our model is the trapezoid that guarantees each investor an 800% return within hours of your initial... Uh-oh, the cops!
So what's our final word on the episode?
It's a wonderful episode. It's a classic. The poignancy of it is on the level of The Way We Was, especially for anyone who's become a parent, had their first kid, or is watching their kid growing up. again, I think we're seeing more of that blend of the sentimentality and the humor increasingly being brought more to the forefront. And it's another classic in this era of where practically every episode is gold, and you're never going to have a run like that in this show ever again. And honestly, I can't think of animated shows like that have had at least this kind of concentrated run that we're looking at.
Yeah, great. Actually, you know what? Before we go, I think I forgot. I was going to tell you where I got my name. So, I was named after a Monty Python sketch. You know, I'd love to say that I was named after some like Nordic character or something cool like that, but nope. I was named after a Monty Python sketch.
That's great.
That's as far as it goes.
That's it. Come closer. Ironic, isn't it? The hunter has become the hunted. Oh, God, Smithers, I feel so alive.
So that's it for this week's installment of the Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, consider showing your support. It's really very simple. Give us a like or a favorable rating. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Anchor FM, and other podcasting platforms, so adding a brief review, if possible, might actually help boost the podcast's profile. And if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all your friends on social media. Speaking of social media, you can follow the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or subscribe to it on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet, and feel free to find me and follow me on Letterboxd, where I frequently post film reviews you may or may not agree with. That's up to you. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back next week to discuss Radio Bart, in which Bart celebrates his 10th birthday, plays an elaborate prank on all of Springfield, and then falls down a well. Clay McCormick of the Penske File will be on hand to discuss that with me, and I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, stay safe out there. Get vaccinated as soon as you can. See you soon.
The year's most talked about film, the year's most acclaimed movie event, the year's box office smash will be the year's top renting video. The year's best kept secret is...